used for classification, and a domain recognizer network that examines the features. The domain recognizer network examines the features and tries to predict which domain they came from. So for example, you could train on Viper and PRID, and the domain recognizer tries to tell whether the features were extracted from Viper or extracted from PRID. Then the feature extractor learns separately in this adversarial game. It tries both to learn features that are good for classification, but also to learn features that confuse the domain recognizer so that all the domains become equally probable. This works well if you want to train on Viper and PRID and then deploy to CUHK. Another really similar idea is called professor forcing. Professor forcing is designed to solve a problem with generating samples using recurrent nets. When you train recurrent networks on, for example, text, you feed in a full sentence of words and condition the recurrent net on each word in the sentence. So when it's estimating the probability distribution over word I, it's conditioned on real words 1 through I minus 1. So it only ever sees real data when it's guessing the next word. It never gets its own outputs fed back in as input for the next time step. After it's been trained that way, when you deploy it to actually generate new text, it will generate the first word, and then it gets conditioned on the first word to produce the second word. So it starts to see its own output as input. And if the output from the recurrent net doesn't match the distribution of real words exactly, then it starts to wander further and further away from valid sentences. Early on, it might pick a few strange words, and then it becomes even more strange because it's now producing words given unusual inputs. Professor forcing is an idea that essentially applies the domain adversarial network idea to recurrent nets, where one domain is the recurrent net clamped to real data, and the other domain is the recurrent net in free running mode. We use an adversarial critic to make sure that the statistics of the recurrent net's hidden units are the same, whether it's run on real data or run in free sampling mode. One of the most popular domains that we want to bridge the gap between is simulated data and real data. One way that we've seen this work is actually using a GAN to enhance synthetic data and make it look more realistic. This is useful because if you want to learn to tell where a person's eyes are looking, it's actually hard to gather real data with labels about where the eyes are pointed, but it's easy to gather lots of unlabeled pictures of eyes with no direction associated with them. It's also easy to make a 3D model and render it with the eyes pointed in directions that you know where they are because you positioned the 3D model yourself. If you just train a model on the synthetic eyes, though, it won't work very well in real photos. So what you can do instead is train a conditional GAN that takes the eyes and makes them look more realistic. So then you can take synthetic 3D rendered eyes with known direction and refine them to appear realistic, and now you have both properties in one sample. You have both realism and a labeled eye gaze direction, and you can then train your model to deploy in the real world. So that's one way of bridging the gap between synthetic and real. We saw another example of more or less the same strategy around the same time in Google's GraspGAN. The idea behind GraspGAN is to train a robot arm to solve grasping tasks where it can pick up objects in this tray. GraspGAN uses synthetic data rendered from a simulator, but then uses a GAN to turn the synthetic images to look realistic. The value of this data is very high because we get both a per pixel class segmentation mask, shown on the right, and a relatively realistic image, as shown in the middle. If we just used real photos, we wouldn't have the per class segmentation mask unless we had people label them explicitly. And if we just used synthetic data, we wouldn't get the realistic appearance. GraspGAN is able to actually perform better on real data using synthetic and real training data put together than if it could use only real data or using only simulated data to train. A more recent approach to generalizing from synthetic to real data is called sim to real via sim to sim. The model is trained to deal with many different simulated conditions, and as long as there's enough diversity in those simulated conditions, it can then deal with the real world. In particular, a GAN is trained to map from randomized simulated domains to canonical simulated domains. So by randomized simulated domains, I mean images generated with the simulator configured to use really weird textures, like shown in the upper left. And then by canonical sim, I mean images like the one in the upper right, where the simulator is set to use relatively flat textures with one specific color for each part of the robot arm. After the GAN has been trained to convert images from very many different randomized simulated domains to the canonical simulator, we can then use it to process the real world and turn the real world into images that look like they came from canonical simulation, as shown in the bottom row. Because we now have this conversion layer that can turn any image into a canonical image, it's possible to train the robot policy only on the canonical simulated images. And then when we deploy it in the real world, the policy never actually sees a real image. It only sees canonical images that were converted on their way in from the camera. And it's actually able to learn to grasp without ever using any real data. You can, of course, also improve its performance by using real data in the training. It's also important to study fairness, accountability, and transparency. One approach to fairness is if you want to make sure your model ignores a certain variable, you can use a technique similar to domain adversarial learning, where instead of trying to make it impossible to recover the domain from the features, you make it impossible to recover a sensitive variable from the features. There are multiple definitions of fairness, and this approach doesn't necessarily satisfy all of them. It doesn't come with a provable guarantee that you've converged to a Nash equilibrium where the sensitive variable has been entirely removed, but you can more or less encourage representations to ignore variables that you think should not affect a decision. A lot of the machine learning literature has recently focused on interpretability. Part of the reason this is important is that we want to be able to tell how machine learning systems are working so that we can make sure that they're fair. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the interpretability techniques we have today imply that the systems work better than they do. And I hope that we see more talk between adversarial machine learning people and interpretability people. We see a lot of systems that examine modern convolutional nets and say, look, they classified the dog as a dog because of the dog pixels, and they classified a cat as a cat because of the cat pixels. So it looks like they're working, but then at the same time, you can take that same model and turn the panda into a gibbon without changing any of the panda pixels significantly. So I hope we can get interpretability tools that are more aware of these kinds of failings. I also believe that as we make models more robust, they'll become more interpretable. We've seen that since about 2015 with some of the first work on adversarial examples that we did at Brain. The image on the left is a linear model, which you might think is interpretable because it's linear. It turns out people have really bad intuitions for how linear models behave in high-dimensional space. Everywhere you see a yellow box, we have successfully turned the input into a different class. So as you read left to right, top to bottom, the first yellow box is where the 9 has become a 0, according to the linear model. The second yellow box, it's a 1. The third yellow box, it's a 2, and so on. So even though this model is linear, it's very hard to convey to a human that it has all of these mistakes baked into it. The model on the right is a robust model, where when we try to maximize the probability of the 0 class, we actually get images that look like zeros. When we try to maximize the probability of the 1 class, we get images that look like 1s, and so on. So even though the model is not linear anymore and might seem like it's harder to understand, the way that it behaves under optimization of its input is actually much more consistent with human intuitions. I'm not saying that this is anywhere near formal enough to have a real fairness tool, but it does give me some optimism that studying robustness will make the interpretability problem easier. And then lastly, I think that adversarial machine learning can actually tell us a lot about ourselves and how our brains work. You can think of adversarial examples as bugs in machine learning models. And we know that the human brain has a lot of bugs like optical illusions. But so far, the optical illusions for humans have been different than the optical illusions for machine learning algorithms. What if we could start to find some bugs that we have in common? Well, recently, some of my collaborators and I found that we could actually make images that fool multiple convolutional nets. And if you get enough convolutional nets participating in this game, and you give humans a time limit, we can actually make images that fool time-limited humans. The picture on the right of the spider is usually correctly classified as a spider. But if we make an adversarial perturbation of it, as shown on the far right, humans with a 200 millisecond time limit will most often classify it as a snake. And then if we take a more extreme version of this approach and allow it to make bigger changes, we can actually take this cat and make it look like it's a dog, even to a human with no time limit. We don't know for sure whether the dog is really a dog and we've changed it too much and we've changed the true class, or whether we've managed to fool even the time-limited human. These are only really the first results about adversarial machine learning for neuroscience, but I think that now that we've seen that there's a little bit of signal here, there's a lot more to explore, and we can learn a lot about the human brain by finding the similarities and differences between bugs in machine learning and bugs in humans. Thank you for listening to my talk. I think I have a few minutes left for questions.
Thank you very much, Ian, for the talk. Questions? There are microphones Do we have any questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I've really noticed also actually in your talk that there's quite a difference between how much interest there is in adversarial networks in academia versus in industry. I see very little use of them in industry. Do you have any feeling of why this is and how it can be solved?
A lot of the companies that are working on machine learning in industry are not really doing image generation stuff. But companies that do work on image generation like NVIDIA and Adobe have been a lot more enthusiastic about them. I don't necessarily think of it as a problem to solve. Just if your business isn't image generation, then I don't see a reason to use that particular tool.
Okay. Well, because you mentioned so many other applications today.
Oh, I'd say like most of the things I talked about were things like machine learning security, where there's other applications. I think for things like model-based optimization, then people will need to use adversarial techniques, but maybe not necessarily GANs. There's a lot less work on model-based optimization right now. I think partly just that's more complicated and less likely to turn into a product immediately than some other things like classifiers or recurrent nets.
Okay, thank you.
Dima?
So I really like the example with the apple in the mesh bag that confuses the classifiers. So you said that adversarial training could help us with examples like that. Can you please clarify? Because I can't really imagine, again, generating an apple in the mesh bag.
Oh, well, so I guess I'm illustrating that the problem is really hard and it's really far from solved. I don't actually know how we're going to solve the apple in the mesh bag. If you wanted to think that you would get there with just adversarial training, in that context, I'm thinking of adversarial training in the sense of optimizing over actions available to the attacker in a threat model. So it's a little bit different than the GAN version. You can imagine if you want to specify a threat model that includes putting mesh bags around things, then using a GAN to represent those actions might be a useful way to tackle it. But I think we're very far from actually demonstrating anything like that.
Thanks.
Okay, we have time for one more. Yes.
Yeah, hi. Generative models, some argue GANs in particular, have poor evaluation metrics, such as FID or inception score. What do you suggest, like, what avenue do you suggest that we think about how we evaluate our generative models moving forward?
Yeah, for a lot of machine learning algorithms, evaluation has gotten really hard. And the gold standard is really to think about what's the downstream task that you want to use them for. If you're hoping to use the GAN for semi-supervised learning, then you can measure accuracy of the classifier at the end. If you want to use the GAN to generate imagery that pleases humans, you can use human evaluation as the property at the end. If you're doing something else, then pick a metric specific to your application area. In a lot of cases, it's not that the metrics are necessarily bad, it's just that there's more than one property the model can have, and you're only going to evaluate one of those properties at a time. So like likelihood measures how much do you put probability mass on the test set, but it doesn't tell whether you've over-memorized the training set. Things like Fréchet inception distance can tell you how close you are in terms of moment matching to the training data, but it doesn't really tell if you've put any mass on anything new on the test set. A lot of the time people just plot curves where they show trade-offs between more than one metric, and that can give you some idea of how it might perform on different downstream tasks. But I don't think there's any real perfect solution. I think it's mostly that we've moved to more complicated models that have more than one performance characteristic, and we can't expect to embed it all in one number.
Cool, thanks.
Let's thank the speaker once more. Next up, we have Florian Tramer talking to us about Slalom, a fast, verifiable, and private execution of neural networks in trusted hardware.
Okay, thank you. So this is joint work that I did as a PhD student at Stanford with my advisor, Dan Bonnet. And it's going to be a great follow-up to Ian's talk, because we'll talk about security, but none of it will involve any adversarial networks. So we'll switch topics a little bit. So the setting I'd like to talk about today is one that's probably very common and that I know a lot of you will have heard about is where a company will be interested in taking some machine learning task and outsourcing this to a public cloud. And this might be a task that relies on some sensitive user data and produces some sensitive output. So as an example you could think about is actually something I learned about very recently is that 23andMe is a company that does genetic processing for its clients. They actually do all of their computation on AWS. And so there's an inherent trust here in this cloud, and that if the cloud provider were malicious, they could steal all the user data that you're uploading and resell it to other parties. Or even if we make the assumption that the cloud itself is benign, well, there might be malware that's infected some of the cloud servers and that also tries to steal data that's uploaded, or even just tries to tamper with the results of some of these sensitive computations. And a pragmatic solution to this problem has in recent years come from this idea of using hardware isolation. The idea here is that you would use a special type of processor that comes with certain isolation guarantees that you could run in the cloud and would provide certain protections to the computation that is being run. So all the inputs here that you send to the cloud would be encrypted, and they would then be processed by this special processor in a way that is completely isolated from the cloud host and from any other programs that run there. The most well-known example of this paradigm is Intel's SGX processor, and there's others that I've listed here, including some academic projects that try to build processors with these very strong isolation guarantees. And the kind of guarantees that we'd want here from these processors are, on the one hand, is what we'd call integrity. This is to say that the cloud or any malware that's on the cloud cannot tamper with the correctness of the computation. And then, of course, privacy, which you could think of in two ways. On the one hand, you wouldn't want the inputs to your computation and the outputs to leak. And you could also ask for the computation itself, so say the model that you deploy, to remain private. The problem when we do this for machine learning is that, well, these processors that we have with these isolation guarantees, the ones we have today, they're actually general purpose, sort of consumer grade CPUs. And that means that the benefits you'd get from uploading your work to the cloud in terms of actually being able to use some of the special purpose hardware we have for machine learning inference, so something like a GPU or a TPU cluster, well, for those we don't have any isolation guarantees, so they'll just sit idle on the cloud and you won't be able to use them. So this is where our work comes in that what we'd like to do is to build a system that does provide you with these strong security properties, these integrity and privacy properties by using hardware isolation, but that somehow can still leverage the fact that we have this extremely fast special purpose hardware that's been built specifically for machine learning or computations. And the way we'll do this is to rely on some specific well-chosen cryptographic primitives to allow work to be outsourced from this trusted hardware processor to the much faster devices for which we unfortunately don't have any isolation guarantees. But we'll want to do this in a way that does allow us to still guarantee integrity and privacy of the computation. And the caveat here is that we will have to relax one of the properties we'd want here, in that we're going to forego model privacy, in that we'll actually allow the cloud to see the type of computation that we want to compute and use this as a way to massively accelerate this computation while maintaining still integrity and privacy. So how does this work? For now, this might seem a little too good to be true, in that we basically want to use fast hardware that provides no security guarantees in a way that does still give us some form of security. And the way we achieve this is by using some, as I said before, some cryptographic protocols to securely outsource computation between this secure processor and a much faster device. And specifically, we'll actually be outsourcing all of the linear computation that happens in a neural network. The reason this works and the reason we can get good performance out of our protocols actually comes from a few insights into how these cryptographic protocols work. First, it turns out that if you look at the type of protocols that the cryptographic community has developed for outsourcing computation, often these sort of work well in theory, but once you try to deploy them, you just never really get good performance out of them because they incur extremely high communication overhead. And it turns out that in our case, we can actually be fine with this because we will be outsourcing computation between two devices that luckily are collocated with each other. So we have on the one hand this secure processor, this enclave, this isolated enclave that sits on the same host, so on the same cloud provider as the sort of faster devices we're trying to outsource computation to. And to give you some idea of what we're talking about here, when we actually implement this and run it with something like a VGG16 network, we actually end up sending something like 50 megabytes of data between the two devices for every image that we run through the network. And so it's really important here that the devices are actually collocated, or this would just not work. Second, it turns out that the cryptographic protocols we have, they're extremely good for outsourcing linear functions. As soon as things are not linear anymore, the overheads just become massively impractical. And this is, again, something that's actually really good in our setting when we look at the type of neural networks that people like to use. And it turns out that in most of these modern deep neural networks, roughly 99% of the computation happens in the linear layers. So something like a convolution or a dense matrix multiplication actually takes way more time to compute than the non-linearities that give these networks their expressive power. And so this image you see here on the right is sort of conceptually showing what Slalom will do is that we'll run the whole computation of a neural network inside this isolated hardware. But as soon as we want to compute one of these linear layers where sort of the heavy work is involved, here we'll use cryptographic protocols to outsource this work to a much faster device while still guaranteeing integrity and privacy. And I'll now tell you in a bit more detail of how this works. So how do you actually outsource a linear operation with integrity and privacy? And I'll focus here on outsourcing the computation of a matrix product. This is without loss of generality, so anything from an actual dense matrix product to a convolution you can represent as a matrix product. So all the techniques we use here can actually be applied to any linear operation that you do in your neural network. So here we have one layer of our network with some weight matrix W, some input matrix X, and we'd like to compute this product Y. And so first we'll talk about how to get integrity. So here we just give this input to this faster device, say a GPU, which would compute the result Y for us, but we have no idea if this result is actually correct. So maybe there was some malware here that was tampering with the results, that was trying to give us false medical diagnosis or anything else. So we'd like a way to very quickly verify that this output was actually correct. And it turns out that there's a beautiful randomized algorithm that's been known since the 70s and due to Freivalds that lets you do this. And the idea is that if you have some matrix product that you want to very, very quickly verify correctness for, what you can do is you can sample some random vector R and just multiply both sides of the equation with this vector and check that everything is still equal. And this will only hold with high probability if the matrices are actually equal. So if there was a mistake in the computation, you'll catch it with very, very high probability by doing this. And in this way, you've reduced the cost of performing a matrix multiplication to just outsourcing this product to a much faster device, and then only having to perform some inner products, some matrix vector products, to actually verify that things are correct, and this is much faster to do. If we additionally want privacy, of course, we're not going to send this input X to the GPU in the clear. And so here we use some additional techniques from cryptography and from these outsourcing protocols where we'll actually encrypt the data with some random blinding factors R every time we send these to the GPU. And this means that the responses we'll get back from the GPU will have some additional blinding factor as well that we need to remove. And the way we can do this is by actually just evaluating the model in an offline phase on fully random data and just storing these pairs R and R times W inside our isolated hardware for future use. So how does this actually look once we implement and evaluate this? So we did implement this using Intel's SGX processor that tries to outsource computation to a much faster sort of state-of-the-art GPU. And we looked at a sort of canonical benchmark here of throughput for inference on ImageNet with different models. And again, the goal here is that we'd want our system, Slalom, that sort of has a trusted enclave talking to a GPU, we'd want the throughput here to be much higher than if we were just running everything inside the hardware, the isolated hardware. So this is our baseline. And we find that if we compare our system to this baseline for a number of networks, so we looked at VGG16, at MobileNet, and the sort of whole family of residual network architectures. I'm just showing one of them here on the slide. We see that we can sort of get up to an order of magnitude, so between 4 and 20x improvement in throughput, depending on if we only care about integrity or if we want to achieve integrity and privacy at the same time. The way this compares to just running everything on GPU, well, of course, privacy and integrity come at a cost, so we will still be a roughly 1 order of magnitude slower than if we had just done everything on GPU and hadn't cared at all about these security guarantees. But this can be improved still a bit further in that it turns out that in our system, the GPU actually sits idle nearly all the time. And so we could get improvement by simply replicating the number of isolated hardware processors that we're using. To conclude, we've shown that this system, Slalom, allows for efficient and secure outsourcing of sensitive neural network evaluations to a cloud using hardware isolation, but then also specific cryptographic protocols to leverage special purpose but insecure or sort of hardware without any isolation guarantees. The big open problem that we'd like to solve here would be to try to extend this to not only inference, but also training. And here it turns out that some of the techniques we use would work and others not really, because we'd kind of also want the model to remain secret the whole time here as well. And so yeah, this is a really cool problem for people to work on, to look at how you could use these isolated hardware processors to also do secure training while getting the best performance out of it. I'll be presenting the poster on this work later today, and if you have questions now, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
We have time for one question, if there's anyone.
Hello, can I ask you, would you be reusing the blinding masks R? Because if you would be reusing them across different inference runs, then it's possible to cancel it out by subtracting 2 inputs into the GPU.
Yes, that's a great point. So in a way, this way that we encrypt inputs, it's actually a one-time pad encryption, so we cannot reuse any of this randomness more than once. And so this is a technique that comes up a lot in these cryptographic protocols, where you would first run the computation only on random data in an offline phase where none of the client data is available. And then in an online phase, you would consume all of this random data for one computation. But yes, you can definitely not reuse it. That's a good point.
Let's thank the speaker again. Next, we have Trian Tran presenting, sounds great to me actually, learning to remember more with less memorization.
Thank you. My talk today is it's about memorizations in neural networks. So you can see from the picture here is the recurrent networks is equipped with a external memory module. Then this work is done by myself and the two co-authors, Hung Lee and Professor Sveta Venkatesh. So we can think memory augmented neural networks as either recurrent networks or standard feedforward networks with an external memory module. So it's designed to capture the long-term dependencies, which we wish to have in a lot of real-life experiments. And somehow it implicitly model the skip connections, which we know that have learnings. It provides a constant path length from the input to output, and in the process is help reducing the gradient vanishing problems. So here's an example of the well-known models, neural Turing machine. It was invented 5 years ago. So it have the controllers that read the input and produce output, and in the process it reads to the memory and read from memory and write to it. The process is actually quite complex because a lot of operations are involved because we would like to have the entire network to be defensible. So involve a lot of attentions in other operations, quite expensive. The problem with the networked memory augmented network today is that we don't have very good theoretical understanding of how the memory works and in what's the case it works best or not really work best. There has been a number of previous works to improve the situations using intuition like location-based writing and readings with temporal linkage, or use other tricks we know from the computer's networks, computer like least use writings and other sparse access to deal with the big memories. But however, our understanding is still very limited, and the networks are quite expensive to run and to train. So our contributions to these problems are, first we derive some measurements on how the network memorizes input over time. And secondly, we propose a few tricks to deal with that, so to get better memorization with less reading and writings into memories. So there are two tricks. One is uniform writings, another one is cache uniform writing. For the matrix, because we don't have very good definition or understanding of how and why the memories works and store information. So we start with a very simple notion of state transitions of the hidden state, HT, which depending on, like for example, we assume it's depending on the previous state and the input of the current state. So in effect, it stores all information from the history. So we define a notion of remembering called CIT, where I it's the input index, and T the current hidden state. So it measures, it somehow captures the notion that how much the state remember the previous input. Because we can intuitively you can see that if the derivative is 0, then we know that the h doesn't depend on the change in x. So we can assume that quite little information being stored in the state. So to measure the average memorization capabilities, we take the average of those CT over time and divide by T. So we call it, it's I, it's index in lambda. So we figure out a couple of properties. One property that we prove that there exists a number lambda that captures the kind of decay effects of how the states remember the information in the past. And as in lambdas, because if lambda is smaller than 1, and we know that it's decaying over time, and basically the state forgets what we read before, long before. So that was the case of standard recurrent neural networks. But for the memory augmented neural networks, we have an external memory of D memory slots. And the case is a little bit more complex, but still the formula is quite similar. So the average memorization is still depending on a couple of things. One is the number of memory slots, which is like intuitive. So with more memory slot, we can remember more. Another one is depending on a parameter called Li, and it depending on depending on lambda, which is measuring how fast the forgetting happens. Because of these measurements, so we can think of a couple of ways to improve it. One is just to increase the number of slots in the memories, which is reasonable, but it could be expensive because most of operations are linear in terms of number of memories. And also increasing the D forever doesn't help either because it stops us from doing good compressions, right? Another trick is to make the decay rate lambda close to 1, which is not easy because we don't really know how to estimate lambda. So the question is that given a fixed number of D and lambda, can we optimize the index L by arranging the optimal writing occurrences over time? So we figured out another property, quite nice one. So given the D memory slot, so it's a sequence of length t's. So the sequence length t's and the average memorization can be maximized by a very, very simple rule that all the indexes L's are equal to T over D plus 1. It's very, very simple rules. So that suggests a couple of, at least one trick for us to do. One is that we can approximate the both solution by define writing rules of the big M here is a memory at time T. So every fixed number of steps we write to the memory, otherwise we keep it at constant. Right? So it's very, very simple rules based on the previous theorem. However, it's based on two assumptions. One is that all time steps are equally important. Another one is that all information are equally important to remember. So those assumptions are okay if the task is like a copy. So we try to memorize everything, right? And the data is quite simple, it doesn't change very much. However, in practice, sometimes it's quite unrealistic to assume that way. So for that, we propose another solution, which is called cage uniform writings. So there is a cage in the process, so that every few steps, maximum length L, we cache the information that the hidden stage produce over time. And then only at certain time step, we commit the memory, those caches into memories. And because we like to reduce information, so we use attention to pick the right time step to write into the memory. Right, so those are two solutions that we propose, and for the rest, I would show the few experiments that we prove by example that it works well. And Here, I think the examples on the neural Turing machine and the differential neural computers with and without the uniform writing. So it shows that for the task here, which is repeating the input occurrence twice, the two tricks actually improve the accuracies and it reduces the reading times. For other tasks, for example, to memorize the input, the trick actually improves the accuracy in both the copying and reverse the task. In the reverse one, we have the sequence of integers, and the task is to try to output a reverse sequence of that. It's quite simple, but the LSTM would fail on this task because it doesn't know how to capture the very long range dependency. It's a sequence very, very long. The NTM and the NCs are better, but we can do even more with the uniform writing strategy. But if the task is to memorize selectively, we don't need to memorize everything, then the cage uniform writing strategy is better. So that agree with the theory that we proposed before. The other experiment is on the sine wave, and we have the first half of the wave, and then try to predict the second half, with and without noise. So in all cases, it proves that the writing strategy, the uniform or case uniform writing strategies, achieves better accuracies. The same result we achieve with the flattened MNIST data. With every pixel becomes a point in the neural networks, in the recurrent networks. Then finally, we have the result with the document classification, and every single word is iterated in the INN. So this one has been well studied, and we have quite good result in the literatures. And what we saw here that we can achieve quite competitive results with the quite sparse writing into the memory. So that is the end of my talks, and if you'd like to hear more, I'll be presenting at the poster session today.
Thanks very much. Do we have a question while the presenter sets up? Okay. In that case, maybe I'll ask one. So these memory-based methods, they seem a little tricky to get going with respect to hyperparameter choice, that they can be very sensitive. The additional hyperparameters you introduced, how tricky is your method with respect to things like that? You've already mentioned that in uniform writing, the frequency can have a big effect depending on the task.
So that's true. It's quite tricky to train. Actually, we didn't do a lot of tweaking. We use standard implementations and use quite default settings. Our contribution is quite theoretical based. So the hyperparameter was estimated from the data. It wasn't tuned by hand. So that was the main things.
Let's thank the speaker one more time. Next, we have learning robust representations by projecting out superficial statistics from Hao-Han Wang.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Hao-Han Wang from Carnegie Mellon University, and today I'm going to share this project, learning robust representations by projecting superficial statistics out. So this talk has three main parts. First, I will talk about the background of our work and the domain generalization without domain ID setup. And then I will introduce the main method and finally highlight some of the experiments we reported. Okay, first, for the background, let's consider a motivating example. Imagine that now we try to build a startup of an app that tells if someone is smiling or not. The first thing we can do is to collect some data around us, label them, and then build a classifier. And interestingly, the people in our city love forests and don't really like noise. So they tend to smell a lot more when they are around trees and smell a lot less when they are at the train station. We collect the data from them and then split the data into different parts, train a classifier, test, and get a very high prediction accuracy. Everything seems fine, except that we don't really know that if the model has picked up some signals from the correlation between the surroundings and the label. Therefore, when we deploy the app to some other city, we might see some interesting performance drop, for the simple reason that people of the other city may have different preferences about when to smell. So this is a classical setup of domain adaptation, where we can try to study the problem of how to adapt our model to some other specific distributions of that target city. However, what if we are more ambitious than that? What if we don't just want our app to be used in that one city? What if we want our app to be used by people all over the world? And that leads to the problem of domain generalization, which is an extension of domain adaptation problem, except that we have no idea about the target distribution now. And domain generalization studies the problem of learning some across-domain robust signals from samples from multiple distributions, as well as with the domain identifications. There is a variety of many methods that can help us to do that. And most methods focus on pushing the model to be invariant to some representations of the domains. And we extend this setup a little bit further, for the reason that we don't always have the domain identification information in reality. For a collection of data, sometimes we don't even know how many distributions these samples are from, let alone which sample comes from which distribution. Therefore, this work studies the problem of domain generalization without domain ID, where we try to train a classifier to learn some robust across-domain signals from training samples from multiple distributions without any external information, and then evaluate the model on some samples from other brand new distributions. So this is the setup. And then for the method, to try to get a model to learn some across-domain robust signals, the first question we try to ask and answer is that, what is the semantic of an image? This question has been asked and answered over several times in different names like semantics, common sense, and even causality, which has been discussed multiple times at this ICLR already. And then what's new our paper can bring onto this table? Unfortunately, we don't really have an answer to this question. However, the most creative contribution our paper makes is that we ask the exact opposite question. What is not semantics? And at least for today, we have a pretty good answer. The superficial statistics of an image, for example, the texture of an image, is barely considered to be related to the semantics. So we have the key assumption of our paper. By pushing the model to rely less on superficial statistics, we can get a model that focuses more on the semantics. And naturally, this leads to the question, how to model superficial statistics. Okay, so computer vision has been developed for around 60 years. And we believe that there might exist some methods at the pre-deep learning era that can fulfill our need. So we investigate these three feature extracting techniques. And we set up some experiments. With a collection of data from multiple distributions, we test the cross-validated performance over a classifier with the features extracted by these three techniques over two different tasks. One is to predict the semantic of image, and the other is to predict the texture of an image. And we get these results. To put it simple, this technique called GLCM works pretty well in predicting the textual information of an image. And more importantly, this GLCM technique works particularly bad in predicting the information at the semantic level. This is exactly what we want. We want a representation learner that can summarize the superficial statistics of an image without learning anything about the semantic of that image, so that further we can try to build other techniques to make the model to rely less on this representation. And it looks like this GLCM is helpful. Then what is it? GLCM stands for Gray-Level Co-occurrence Matrix. It has a very simple idea of counting the pixel pairs. Given an image and its pixel representation, GLCM generates this giant matrix of the features where each cell is a count of the pixel pairs. For example, we have 3 of these 6-2 pixel pairs, then we put a 3 at that position. And we have 2 of these 8-7 pairs, so we put a 2 at that position. GLCM fill in this entire matrix, and then we get a representation of an image that, according to our experiment, is a good representation of the superficial statistics of image and a bad representation of the semantic of an image. And then how do we use it? It took a while for deep learning to finally free the feature engineering process of traditional machine learning. So we don't really want to set it back. Therefore, we proceed to develop some new neural GLCM architecture that enables end-to-end learning with differentiable weights. However, I don't really want to make this talk mathematical heavy. So if you are interested, please refer to our paper or come to our poster later today. And finally, I want to introduce one more technique that we used to push the model to rely less on superficial statistics representation. Given representations learned by a CNN and representations learned by our GLCM architecture, we want to train the model with a representation that is linearly independent of the GLCM representations. And to do that, we built a simple linear regression system. We use the GLCM representation to regress the CNN representation, and we use the residue of these linear regressions to train our model. This entire linear regression process can be summarized pretty neatly into this one line of equation. But again, if you want more details, please refer to the paper or come to our poster later. Okay. And as the last part, I want to introduce some of the experiments we did. The first one is a synthetic experiment that is a direct extension of our motivating example. So we work on sentiment classification, where we have 7 different sentiment labels, and we attach 7 different backgrounds to the data, following the rule that for training and validation data sets, the background and the label are correlated. And for testing data sets, the background and the label are independent. And we vary the degree of the correlation in our experiments. So the results are here, but it's not very clear. To put it simple, our method tends to perform well and stable over a varying degree of correlations. And at very last, we also want to report the results on some standard benchmark data sets. This data set is called PAX. It's a 7-way classification over 4 domains. And we have the results here. And our method is reported at the very last column, competing with previous state-of-arts. And please notice that our method is the only one that does not rely on domain identifications. And yet it is still slightly shy in comparison to the state-of-art called Fusion, which does not only rely on domain identifications, but also 3 times larger than ours. And we need to make it clear that we used some training heuristics when we work on this data set. And we noticed that these training heuristics are particularly helpful for this data set. Okay. If you are interested in our work and want to try it to some other applications, we have released our code together with some instructions at the first GitHub link. Or if you are interested in this line of research and want to extend it further, we have released every single line of the code that is generates the numbers we reported at the second GitHub link. And finally, thanks to the collaborators, Zhe, and Eric. And if you want more information, please come to our post at number 10 later. Thank you.
Thank you, Hao Han. We have time for one question, perhaps, if there are any from the audience. Okay. It was a very interesting talk. What do you, so how do you think you could approach a problem where the texture actually is or the superficial statistics here, so for example, in fluorescence microscopy, the Haralick work that you cited was, when I started my grad school anyway, state of the art for classifying proteins. Do you have any thoughts about other sorts of things you could project out instead?
So other sort of statistics that we should project out?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great question. I think one advantage of our work is that we kind of open this door of try to invite domain experts to tell us what are the statistics that they don't want to rely on. So that I think that's a question that can be answered when we try to collaborate with more domain experts, and they should have a very good answer to that question. Okay.
Let's thank the speaker again. We have our last talk of the session from Robert Geierhos on similar topic, actually, that ImageNet trains convolutional neural networks are biased towards texture, and increasing shape bias improves accuracy and robustness. Take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm very glad to be here today to talk about our work on texture versus shape. The motivation behind our work was a very fundamental question, actually. It's the question, how do CNNs actually recognize objects? And sort of, if we look at different explanations, the standard textbook explanation tells us that, well, they detect object shapes, object parts. For example, in the first layer, they detect edges. Then they group together a bunch of edges to form a door. And once they've detected a shape like a door or a couple of windows, they can again group these basic parts and shapes together to, for example, the house here. So CNNs recognize objects by detecting object shapes. This is sort of the standard explanation. Now, this explanation is super intuitive. It seems to make sense to us as humans, but it's also deeply unsatisfying in a way. It's unsatisfying because it predicts that if the shape is missing in an image, that then a CNN should fail to recognize the image. And this is not what we actually find in practice. So if you look at these images, they more or less look garbage to us, but CNNs will have no trouble identifying the dog here, actually. This is just a texturized version of this dog image. And this is really something that's sort of a challenge for the shape explanation of CNN object recognition. And this led us to think about a different explanation, actually. We thought, well, maybe the texture, the local statistics, really low level, rather than the global object shape, could be responsible for CNNs recognizing objects. So this explanation is really the texture explanation of CNN object recognition. But sort of how do we find out what is texture or shape that's more important for a CNN to recognize objects? And to this end, we designed an experiment. And now in normal standard images, for example, this cat here, it's kind of hard to tell whether a CNN is using shape or texture because both are present. The cat has a cat shape and a cat texture, so it's hard to tell which is the crucial feature that a CNN is using. So we decided to go the other way around, actually, and artificially create images that have the shape of one category and the texture of a different one. So for example, here we can create this weird-looking cat with elephant texture, with now the shape from one category, the texture of a different one. And we use style transfer, actually the technique that's usually being used to transfer the style of a painting onto a photograph. We use style transfer here to generate images like these. And we've generated thousands of these images, always the shape from one category, the texture of a different one. And then we can actually look at classification decisions. Would a CNN now recognize this cat with elephant texture as a cat or as an elephant? to tell us more about whether a CNN is using shape or texture. Now, so we've generated thousands of these images. We've shown them to both CNNs and also human observers in the lab and recorded the classification decisions. And for humans, actually, if we plot here now the responses, we see that it's all on the shape side, actually. So this cat with elephant texture, if the response was cat, would be counted towards shape bias. If the response was texture, would be counted, response was elephant, would be counted towards texture bias. And here humans actually have this super strong shape bias. There's no doubt about that. And now we looked at ImageNet trained CNNs, for example, ResNet 50 here. And it's completely on the opposite side of the spectrum. ResNet has a huge shape bias. And this is really a key difference between human and CNN object recognition. Humans have this shape bias, and at least ResNet seems to have a huge texture bias here. And this is not something that's specific to this particular network. We've tested lots and lots of other networks as well. For example, here, VGG, GoogleNet, AlexNet, they're all in blue, very much on the texture side. So to conclude this part of our work is we've seen that CNNs seem to be using textures much more than we actually thought. They seem to ignore shapes much more than humans. They really have a strong texture bias. But something that we still don't know is, well, is there anything that we can do about this? Can we change the texture bias into a shape bias? And this is sort of the leading question for the next part of our experiments, which was really the idea, can we do anything about it? Can we induce a shape bias in CNNs? And sort of our motivation behind the next step was to think about why would CNNs have a texture bias in the first place? Is it a bug or perhaps even a feature? And we thought, well, perhaps textures are just the easiest strategy possible to solve a task like ImageNet. Perhaps recognizing a cat by the cat fur is just way easier than detecting the object shape, which can also change depending on viewpoint and so on. So perhaps texture is just the easiest strategy. And that led us to an experiment actually where we thought, okay, can we create a data set where we take the texture away so that the texture is no longer correlated with the class of the data set? And to this end, we created stylized ImageNet. It's basically a copy of original ImageNet, but for every single image, we replaced the original texture, which is, tells us something about the class. We replaced it with an arbitrary texture from a random painting via style transfer, just to have a data set where the texture is no longer telling us anything about the class. And then we trained networks again on this stylized ImageNet, and then had a look at whether anything changes in terms of texture or shape biases. Now this is still a plot from before. We've seen this huge difference between human shape bias and CNN texture bias. And now the same network, ResNet 50, trained on stylized ImageNet instead of ImageNet, does actually move much closer towards human perception. We now see that these orange squares have moved from a texture bias towards a shape bias. And this really tells us that the same network architecture is able to have both a texture bias, as is the case when trained on ImageNet, and a shape bias when trained on this new data set where the texture is no longer sufficient to solve the task. And this is sort of really what we can take away from here, that the texture bias isn't something very specific to CNN architectures. This is something that is sort of a property of the training data set. And when we train on different data set, we can actually induce a shape bias instead. And for the last part of our work, we thought, well, maybe let's have a look whether there are any benefits of having a shape bias. Why do humans perhaps have a shape bias? Are there any cool aspects that come out of it? And we've looked at a couple of metrics, for example, here. We always compare ResNet 50, same architecture, once trained on ImageNet, once trained on stylized ImageNet, texture bias versus shape bias. And we can see that actually for ImageNet object recognition, we get slightly improved performance just by including stylized ImageNet in the training data. And also we get quite a bit of a boost on object detection data sets. such as Pascal-Wok or MS-Coco here. Just having a shape bias really seems to be helpful in terms of how well the features transfer to object detection here. However, the most interesting finding, at least from my perspective, was when we started asking ourselves the question, why would humans have a shape bias in the first place? Why are humans not just using the texture of objects to recognize them? Why are humans focusing on the shape of a cat to know that it's a cat? And while this is pure speculation, we thought, well, perhaps that's related to how easily a certain feature is distorted when there's noise. For example, when we look at noisy images, when some sort of noise is applied, and this could be really relevant for humans. You want to recognize animals out there, even though it's snowing. And when there's noise, actually, we can see that the local structure, the texture, is very much distorted and changed. However, the shape seems to be really intact during this adding of noise. So perhaps the reason why humans have the shape bias in the first place is because shape is just much more robust towards distortions. And this is pure speculation, but we decided to give it a go and test it on networks, compare the original network against the one with a shape bias and see whether there's anything changing in terms of robustness towards distortions. And this is what we did next. So here we can see classification accuracy on the y-axis plotted as a function of how much noise we add, how severe the distortion is. In this example, it's uniform noise added to an image. And Resonate 50, actually, standard ImageNet training texture bias, we can see that there's a pretty sudden drop, actually, in accuracy. Is this good? Is this bad? Well, when comparing to human data, actually, we've shown the same images to human observers. We can see that, actually, it's pretty bad. Humans are far more robust. And now the interesting part is, well, where would CNN with a shape bias actually be on this plot? And this is what we can see here. Again, the orange squares. We see that actually Resonate 50 with a shape bias, same architecture, no other modifications, same hyperparameters, simply different training data inducing a shape bias gives us better performance, more robustness for this particular form of noise. And this is actually not something that's specific to uniform noise, to the example here. We've also tested a bunch of other distortions, and we've actually discovered that just having a shape bias gives us improved performance on actually all of these distortion types depicted on this slide here. Even though the network had never seen fog before, or uniform noise, or glass blur, or any of these distortion types. So really, we get an emergent sort of noise robustness without ever showing the network any of these particular noise types during training. So this really seems to be an emergent property of a shape bias. And this is sort of the quite interesting finding, because this was not something that's the network was trained to do. It's really an emergent property. So to sum up our work, we've seen that by default, CNNs seem to be using textures much more than shapes when trained on standard data sets. But this is not something that's impossible to change. Simply by changing the training data to this stylized ImageNet version, we can induce a shape bias, and we get improved features, and especially emergent noise robustness for free when training networks to have a shape bias. And with that, I'd like to thank my amazing team from Tübingen. That's Patricia, Claudia, Matthias, Felix, and Wieland, and all of you for your attention. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Robert. It looks like we have some questions. Yeah.
So I'm very curious. Is your network with the shape bias robust to adversarial perturbations?
That's an excellent question, actually. So here I've only shown these sort of natural distortions, and we get improved performance across the bank here on these. We've tested adversarial robustness as well, and we don't see much of a change here. So I guess adversarial examples are still an open topic to be solved.
Thanks.
Over there, yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So when you talk about the stylized ImageNet, so you're just saying that use the random textures. But I think how you're gonna stylize the images can affect your results pretty much. So just random is okay, or you have some failures on this stylized ImageNet, or do you have any more comments on this method?
So I guess it would be interesting to explore whether certain kinds of stylization work better than others.
Right.
Here, we really thought that simply a random texture would make sense because we just want to remove the original texture and just destroy it, basically, to get rid of it, to force the network to learn something else. But yeah, could be definitely worth exploring. Yeah.
Thank you.
In the center?
Thank you for the talk. Is it possible that the texture bias arises only in the object detection task or classification task and not in other tasks, so it is possibly task dependent?
That's something we haven't explored. We have data for ImageNet, object recognition, and also for open images, which is a different training data set also for object recognition. And we find the same texture bias in these settings. I think it really seems that texture is the easiest strategy. So whenever there's a task where the texture is sort of a shortcut to solve the problem, my best guess would be that the network actually learns texture before it learns any other higher level properties of the task.
Thank you.
DJ?
Thanks for a very interesting talk. So I was wondering if rather than replacing the texture randomly, if you replaced it adversarially, would that make a difference to the results, and would that improve performance in any way?
What do you mean by adversarial replacement of texture?
If you have some kind of parameterization of textures and you could search through the space of texture replacements, could you adversarially choose the one that most confuses the classifier and then kind of train to be robust against an adversarial replacement of the texture?
Okay, yeah, interesting question. We haven't explored that. I think it would be possible in principle. Yeah, we've just used random textures so far.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Did you try to train the network with natural distortions? And if yes, what was the result?
Mm-hmm. Actually, we've tried that in earlier work where we thought, okay, how can we achieve robustness towards natural distortions? And a key finding here was that when we train on even like 8 different types of distortions simultaneously, the network gets very good on these 8 types, but it fails to generalize to a novel 9th type of distortion. So this generalization failure is really something that cannot be solved with just augmenting the training data with like lots of different types of noise. And this is also why I'm super excited about this year, that the shape bias actually seems to be something that helps, even though distortions weren't part of the training data. The robustness still generalizes to novel distortions, and this seems to be an inherent property of a shape bias that does not appear when simply augmenting the training data with noise.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. Do you have any thoughts on how to get more shape bias? Because I noticed there's still not the same level of shape bias as humans have, which might be desirable.
Excellent question. Yeah, there's still a bit of a gap between human shape bias and network shape bias at the moment. I think so far we've just explored different training data, but actually architectural modifications could push a network towards shape bias. So this is something that could help in the future, as well as changes of the loss function. So far, we've really just explored the training data, but there are different knobs to tweak. And I'd be very curious to find out which would be the last missing bit towards human shape bias.
And last one.
When you were comparing the 2 ResNet 50 models, were they trained on the same number of examples and for the same number of iterations?
Mm-hmm. So the standard one trained on ImageNet was just a pre-trained model from PyTorch. And the model with the shape bias was then trained on stylized ImageNet using ImageNet pre-training. But then during training on stylized ImageNet with exactly the same number of epochs as the ImageNet network.
Okay, thank you.
Let's thank the speaker one more time. And that concludes our session. There's a coffee break right now. We've run a couple minutes over into it, and posters start at 4:30. Thanks very much.